So we've finally reached the point now where we can actually go and map townland boundaries. So when you're mapping a townland boundary, there's several existing features that you can use as part of your boundary. You can essentially use any way that that already exists. So for example, if your townland boundary butts up against this road, you can use the road as part of your boundary. You can use rivers. So for example, this part here is tagged as a river. It's the Grange River, but it's also a member of this townland boundary. You can use streams, tracks, essentially any kind of a way can be used as a townland boundary. The one thing you cannot use as part of your townland boundary is an existing area. So you can't cut a portion of an existing area to act as your boundary, and I'll show you why this is the case. If, let's say, I draw part of a way here and continue it on going up along this ditch here. So essentially I'm saying from here along down here and down here is one end of my townland boundary. Well, obviously I'd need to cut this one here and press P to split it, so that I essentially have these three parts acting as one side of my boundary. However, if I try and upload, what you'll see is unclosed way. So what we've basically done there is we've taken a closed area, i.e. a forest, and we've essentially broken one side of it, so now it's unclosed. So that's an error that you cannot that you can't accept, that you can't upload. Okay, so I'm just going to Control Z to get rid of all of this. Should be everything, and that's closed again. Yep. So now that we know what we can use and can't use as part of our townland boundary, now I'm going to show you how to actually read. I'll just hit Alt+2 here just to toggle on this layer. I'll show you how to read these map sheets so as you can actually clearly identify where the boundaries are. So if I zoom in just down here, I'm going to hit Alt+3 just to turn off the data layer. Now, one thing you'll notice when you're looking at these, if I go, yeah, here's a good example. So if you look at the actual names of these townlands, you'll see some of them, the type is very close together, and others the type is spread further apart, and then others then again type is spread really far apart. This is actually a very good indicator of where your townland boundary is. If the first letter and the last letter will pretty much always butt right up against a townland boundary. So where we see Hillsbrook Dements, up along here is one side of your townland boundary, and along here is another side of your townland boundary. So if you're having trouble actually identifying the boundaries, just look for other ones that are nearby and try mapping those out, and you can always find them, find the actual boundary by looking at the first letter and the last letter. First letter, last letter. Always, almost always butt right up against the boundary itself. So now on to reading the boundaries. So all the townland boundaries are made up of these dots. However, these dots intersect with certain elements in the real world. So if you look here, you'll see these lines. These lines essentially relate to walls in a field. So if I turn off the sheet, you can see here, switch it back on. So you can see this line coming down here relates to this wall that would have gone up here. And these two lines going up here relate to these two walls here. So where a townland boundary intersects those, you'll see your wall slightly changing. So here's your wall coming up here, but you'll see now the wall is slightly dotted. So that's where you can see your townland coinciding with your walls. When your townland gets down to the road, you can see, I'll use this side here as an example. So on this little road coming up here, essentially the middle of that road is your townland boundary. and it continues on down here and goes down to this point here, at which point it ends. Now, to try and follow the boundary from there, then if you look down here, you can see Lissa Valley Glebe. Again, first letter, last letter, both put up against a boundary. So just by simply looking at it, you can see the dots traveling down this side here, and again the dotted line traveling down along here as well, as opposed to how these walls look here, which are more or less straight drawn lines. Another example is where, for example here, your Townland boundary you can see traveling up this way. You can also see another boundary traveling up this way, and another one traveling down here. But you also have another boundary coming here. This is also part of your Townland boundary, but it also acts as an additional boundary, sometimes called rural districts or poor law unions. So it's essentially where 2 or possibly 3 boundaries are overlapping. That's when you'll see this dash dot, and that again will continue on down to here. Something else to note with this particular area here, where you have 1, 2, 3, 4 boundaries intersecting in one area. If I switch off the sheet just by pressing Alt and 2 together, you'll see there's very little here apart from what looks like a wheelchair forest. So if I switch between my layers again, trying to figure out where this line comes down here, I can see it'll more than likely follow this wall down here. But then when I get to here, I start to lose sight of it. And this boundary traveling down here and intersecting another boundary at this point, looks like it roughly travels down this line here. And this one that travels up here, again, you can roughly make out where it travels along. Now, the reason I wanted to bring particular notice to this here is this is why it's incredibly important when you're rectifying your map sheet that you put as many points as possible on it. As I mentioned before, 30 to 40 points is a good amount to have on your sheet when you're rectifying it. If you use only a handful of points, 5 or 6 points, then when you try looking at this cluster of boundaries, what you'll find is it could be off over here. So trying to actually line it up to physical features will be incredibly difficult. In addition, what you'll find sometimes is you may find boundaries like this in the middle of a bog with absolutely no markings whatsoever on the bog. So again, this is why it's incredibly important when you do spot something like that, that you do have enough markers placed when you're rectifying so that you can trust the placement of the sheet and essentially map your boundary along the boundary marked by the sheet rather than the physical feature below, which might just be a brown bog with no lines or markings or ditches or road or anything in it. And just while searching around for something else, I've actually come across a bog area here where a boundary cuts straight through the bog, but there's no real physical features to map it up against, and that's this here. So you'll see a line coming down here. If I just reduce the visibility on that, you'll see it doesn't really line up to anything. You can see down here, this boundary that travels down here lines up to this ditch, but this one going through the middle here really doesn't match up to anything on the ground. Okay, up here you have a few markings that you could possibly line up against, but other than that you have nothing. So again, this again just emphasizes the importance of when you're rectifying to make sure you have enough points and that the point you're rectifying against, that the OpenStreetMap data is accurate underneath. So just to show you here, say for example where this boundary comes down here, you can see it accurately intersects this ditch in the imagery below. So now that we know what the boundary looks like and how to read it, I'm going to show you how to actually draw them now. So when you're starting off with what's essentially a virgin sheet, no boundaries already marked on it, what you want to try and do is find a small townland to start with first. So for example, this one here, 20 acres, or this one over here. Actually, there's 2 or 3 fairly small, 30 to 90 odd acre size townlands. It's good to start with those first, because usually those you can pretty easily see the boundary very obviously, so you don't have to spend too long digging around and searching trying to find it. So for this one here, 20 acres, I'm going to draw out the boundary and show you how I'm going to do that. So if I look here, I can see if I hold Alt and press 3 and turn off the data layer, so I can see that the boundary comes down along here, travels along this road, and then there's another boundary that comes up the side here, and then comes off this side and then back down here. So essentially this is my 20 acres townland here. So if I switch off my map sheet and just look at the imagery below, I can see that this side coming down here, again I'm just pressing Alt and 2 just to flick that map sheet off and on again, which you'll find once you start mapping these you'll do quite a bit, because it's easy enough to actually get lost when you're drawing out some of these boundaries. So I can see it'll come down here, and if I zoom in here I can see that this boundary comes down at a slight angle. So rather than bringing it down on this side to the road, I'll actually be stopping here and coming down along this wall here. Then my boundary runs the middle of the road to this point here, and then goes back up this side. And here again, you can see my boundary is coming up along here, but on the imagery below I have nothing to actually match that up against. So at approximately this point here, my map sheet no longer matches my imagery below. So in that case, I'm going to be using the actual map sheet boundary itself to mark out this point here. And again, this reinforces what I've been saying about making sure that you rectify everything correctly with a load of points, and that your data that you're rectifying against is accurate as well. We're finally at the point now where we're actually going to draw a couple of these boundaries. So I'm going to start at this point down here where the boundary comes down to this point and meets the main road. So essentially my boundary is going to be coming down here and going to be joining the road. So what I want to do is I'll start with the road here, and it'll be meeting at approximately this point here. So on this node I'm going to select the road, select the node, and hit P. And what that does is it essentially splits the road into 2 parts, because this side is going to be part of my boundary. So from that point then I'll press A and essentially just start drawing my boundary. So I can see it comes up along here. So I'm more or less following up this side here. And again, Alt and 2 just to flick the map sheet off and on again. Again, as I mentioned before, JOSM does this sort of weird accounts from the bottom up, so this will be Alt plus 1, Alt plus 2, or Alt plus 3. So this is the point here at which my imagery no longer matches my map sheet. So now I'm going to be mapping off of my map sheet itself. Now, at this point here, I can see there's a boundary that continues on up here, and the boundary I'm actually working on for 20 acres goes out this way. So, because I'm going to be splitting this boundary here, because it's going to be shared by a townland over this side here, what I can do is I can hold Alt, and you'll see it changes very slightly if I just turn off all the imagery. You'll see instead of a complete way, when I hold Alt, at the very end there's kind of a line through the node. So basically when I click the next node, what I end up with is two separate ways here essentially. So it essentially cuts it at that point, which can be handy when you're doing an awful lot of these. You don't have to keep going splitting a load of boundaries. So I'm just Control Z to undo that and turn my imagery layers back on. So at this point here I'm going to hold down Alt to split that, because this boundary here is also going to be shared by this townland over here. So essentially this townland will be only taking this part rather than this part. So I'll hold Alt and click, and now I've essentially started a new way there. So now this comes along here, and it looks like to follow slight difference between the two. I know this can be almost like looking at a strobe light sometimes when you're flicking between these two imagery layers, but unfortunately there's no way around doing this. So I'm going to follow my map sheet for this point here. Yeah, and it looks like it's coming over to meet this wall, so then I can follow this wall up then. And when you're tracing against these walls, what you need to know is the boundary that's marked out on this sheet is essentially been smoothed. So if there's an old wall here that's kind of got small little waves in it back and forth or whatever, where it might look like a straight line on the map sheet, you really want to map again. You really want to follow the top of that wall, to follow all those little waves and kinks and whatever along that wall, because that is your boundary. Okay, so I'll keep going down here. Go back one. So I'll continue this on and come back once it's done. I'll show you the completed boundary. Okay, so I've finished drawing my boundary around here. Now I'm just going to select each part of it. So I'm just going to hold down Control. There we go. If I can switch off my layers here. So essentially this is my townland here now. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is, as I mentioned before, where we put the Townland preset up on the toolbar, I'm just going to click on that. I'm going to type in my name of my Townland. Actually, this looks like it's all one word, I think. 20 acres. And again, if you know the Irish name or an alternative name for any of these, by all means fill it in there. Then you just click on New Relation, and it'll bring you to your relations window. The important thing that you're looking for here is this loop. So essentially you have your start point and it loops around and comes back. So that's your closed boundary. If you don't have that loop, then you're missing a piece of your boundary, or there's a part of your boundary that you haven't split. Okay, so once you have this closed boundary, simply click, type in down here, outer, and just apply to all three or all of the ways that you've selected for your boundary, and then just click OK. And that's it. So just to run through that again. Just click on your Townland preset, type in the name, make sure it's closed, click here to apply the outer role, and then click OK. So that's it. That preset makes mapping these townlands very easy from a relations point of view, because relations can get very, very messy sometimes. So I'm going to go through a couple more townlands. I'll map those out, and I'll show you a couple of other little tips and stuff along the way. So one thing I had actually forgotten to do was to turn on my Townlands map style, which here you can see there's a kind of a green, light green shading up here. So there are Townlands mapped up here, but it's quite difficult to make them out. If I turn on my Townlands boundary map style, again, to access that, look on this side here for your painter's palette. Click that and it'll open this small little box here. That makes it an awful lot easier to actually see which townlands have been mapped and to see the actual boundaries of each townland. Now that you have your first townland mapped, what you want to do is go ahead and upload, and it's advisable to upload after each townland that you've mapped, simply because JOSM's validator will very often spit out errors if you've made any mistakes along the way. If you do a bunch of townlands in a row and then go ahead and upload, what you can find is you'll have to do an awful lot of work to fix some of those errors. So I'm going to go ahead and hit on upload here. And just going to change the name here to 20 acres. This is just helpful for anybody else who happens to be reviewing your changes, just in case it causes some other issue. They'll be able to identify the exact one. So I just have a typical one here, adding the townland in County Galway, and I just change the name each time to the name of the townland I'm uploading. So I'll just let that upload, and there was no errors, so everything's fine with that. So the next townland I'm going to map is called 40 acres, and the one I'll do after that is Lissa Valley Glebe. And the reason I'm going to do this one in particular is because it'll use boundaries belonging to 20 acres and 40 acres as part of its boundaries. So just to get cracking, I'll start with 40 acres. So if I just turn off the data layer by pressing Alt and 3, and again using the first letter and last letter as indicators for where the boundary should be, I'll start here and travel up, and I can see here my boundary dots are overlaid on top of a wall, so I can follow those up here, and they go up to here. And if I just turn off that, yeah, I can see they follow existing features in the satellite layer. They go up to here and then come back down. Comes down along here, yeah. It follows back down. So it should keep going, yeah. I can follow it the whole way down and ends up back down this point and comes back up this side. So yeah, it's pretty easy to see this boundary the whole way around. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to map that one out really quick, and I'll come back to you at the point where I'm naming it and adding the relation for it. So I've just finished drawing out all the boundaries for this townland, 40 acres. So I'm going to go ahead and select them and create the townland. So again, you want to select your boundaries in sequence. So think of it essentially as drawing a circle, just with a couple of different lines. So you want to draw your boundary in one go by selecting everything in the correct sequence. So once I have that, I'm going to hit my preset button up here, put in the name, and click on New Relation. I have my full loop, so I can go ahead and click Apply Role Outer, and then just click OK, and I'm done. So now I'm going to upload that. So JOSM has told me there's no errors, so I have nothing to fix, so I can go ahead and just upload. So once that's finished uploading, I'm going to do this one here, Lissa Valley Glebe. And I'm going to go through this one step by step, just to show you exactly how you go about using boundaries of other townlands as well. So this particular one is 86 acres. So I can see here by 40 acres this is where it gets confusing. 20 acres is 34, 40 acres is 74. Fortunately, can't be helped, those are just the ones I happen to pick. So this one here is 86, so it's essentially this area here that I'm just dragging my cursor around. So I have a boundary on this side which I can use. I have boundary up here, select it. So that's almost 2 full sides of my townland. So essentially I just want this bit here and this bit coming down here and here. So that will give me the other 2 and a bit sides for my townland. So I'm going to start up here. If I switch off my data, again I can see my boundary or my townland dots essentially running down the middle of the road to this point here. So if I turn off my map sheet, I've actually got somebody's driveway here. So if I come further back to here and try and follow it up and see, does the boundary actually go down the driveway, does it go down the wall on the left of the driveway or the right of the driveway, or so on. So basically I'll zoom in here, turn off that, and I can see it's following, just let that imagery load, I can see it's following this this wall coming down here. It looks like it's following this the whole way. Yep. Yep. So essentially my boundary is going to come down along this bush here and then onto the walls the whole way down there. So because my boundary is on the road and stops on the road there and then comes down to here, on this point here I'm going to add a node. So just press A and double click at the point you want and then just hit P to split the road. So again I've now got 2 sections of that road. So at that point that I've split, I'm now going to press A and start drawing my boundary down here. So again, this is where it gets quite difficult when you pick bushes or trees. So where I can spot the wall, I'm actually going to align exactly to it. You have to excuse the blurry satellite imagery, my connection isn't working very well this evening. And just zoom out here and just flick again, yeah. So I can keep on essentially going all the way down here, cutting through this road down to roughly this point here and then come across. So yeah, I can see my boundary as well comes down through this bit of a track that's here and then juts over and then continues down. So essentially juts over to here. And then intersects with this road. And then comes to approximately this point here. So thankfully I can actually see by the 2 different types of trees here, roughly where my boundary is going to go along here. So I'm just going to add this next node. And then I'm just going to press S to go to selection. Click on my road here where I've intersected. And click on my node and hit P again to split. So now again I have 2 sections of road there. One thing to note is I didn't put a node on the outline of this forest. As I mentioned before, your boundaries shouldn't come in contact with areas that are already mapped. Coming in contact with ways is fine, but shouldn't come in contact with closed areas. So I'll finish this one off, and essentially I can tell by this that it's pretty much a straight line. So as I said, by the two different types of trees here, it's pretty more or less obvious as to where my boundary went, but I'm just going to use the sheet as it's a straight line and just go back and hit S to select. So now I have my full boundary drawn. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these now. So I'll start with this one here, which brings me up to here. And I'm going to go up, hold Control, and click on this piece of the road. Hold Control again, click on this piece of this boundary, hold Control, select the next piece, and hold Control to select this final piece here. So I'm selecting boundaries which belong to other townlands, but it's not a problem. Again, because I'm using this preset, all these relations won't interfere with each other. They may share boundaries, they may share ways. It's not a problem. So I'm just going to hit my preset button. So it's Issa Valley Glebe. Just going to copy that, save me typing it again. Hit new relation, and I've got my full loop. So I'm just going to apply the outer roll and click OK. And that's it. And just upload. And JOSM tells me there's no errors. So I'm done. So that's essentially how you map the townlands. Unfortunately, I've had to go through, must be well over an hour and a bit now of videos to actually get to this point. But as you can see, there's quite a bit to do to actually get to this point where you're aligning these sheets and rectifying the sheets and cropping the sheets and then reading the boundaries and actually mapping the townlands. Once you get to the point where you're mapping the townlands, it takes a bit of time to get used to actually reading these maps, but once you do, you should quite easily map 5-10 townlands in an hour. Okay, best of luck. In the next video I'm going to go through a couple other tips and tricks and troubleshooting, and I'll go through some possible errors that you may see when you're trying to upload or when you're trying to create the relations as well, and I'll show you how to fix those and sort them out. For more information on mapping townlands in Ireland, go to the OpenStreetMap wiki and search for mapping townlands. And on the search page you will see a link to the main section and also to the Townlands video series. On the Townlands video series section you will find a summary for each episode, links to each individual episode, and also a list of links for any software or websites mentioned in each episode.